I'm standing in a coal miner's workshop outside Harlan, Kentucky, and the first thing I notice is the tools. Not how they look, but how they don't look. There's a socket wrench on the pegboard that has been hanging in this shed for 54 years. No rust, not a speck. A hammerhead that came down from his grandfather in 1947, dark metal, perfectly preserved. A spreader bar, a pry tool, a cold chisel. All of them original steel, none of them corroded, sitting 3 feet from a window where rain and humidity have been trying to wreck them for half a century. And the man who owns them, a retired miner named Calvin, he walks me over to a shelf where there's a tin of something that costs exactly $3.17. That's the entire secret. That's what coal country never forgot, while the rest of America got sold a replacement for it every decade. I spent the next hour standing in that workshop watching him work, and what I found underneath those tools changed how I think about every hand tool I own. Because what happened in that shed is the same thing that happened in every coal mine from eastern Kentucky to southern West Virginia to eastern Ohio, a technique for preserving steel that cost almost nothing and worked perfectly, got replaced by an industry that needed you buying spray cans and plastic bottles and specialized products that accomplished less than what you already had. And the reason it got replaced had nothing to do with the products working better. It had everything to do with how much money could be made when a tool that should last 50 years costs you that $3 investment and then nothing ever again. Here's what we're looking at. The average American household throws away or replaces hand tools at a rate that would have made a coal miner laugh. A socket set that oxidizes and seizes up, screwdrivers that develop rust pits and won't drive straight anymore. Adjustable wrenches that frost over and stick, drill bits that corrode and snap, garden tools that deteriorate into uselessness every 3 to 4 years of garage storage. You buy replacements, you buy a new set every 3 to 5 years on average. And over a 30-year ownership of a house, you're looking at somewhere between $1,200 and $2,000 spent on replacing hand tools that should have lasted your entire life. The coal miners of Appalachia never figured they had money to burn on that kind of replacement cycle, so they didn't. I found the first real documentation of this in a University of Kentucky Extension bulletin from 1952 titled Tool Preservation and Maintenance for the Kentucky Farm. It was written by a man named Dr. James Whitley, an agricultural engineer who spent the summers of 1949, 1950, and 1951 visiting coal mining communities across eastern Kentucky, specifically to document how they maintained equipment on next to nothing. The bulletin is now sitting in a basement archive at UK that almost nobody visits. I held a copy of it 2 summers ago, and on page 8, Whitley documented the exact technique that coal country used and had been using for generations. Simple mineral oil, applied to tool surfaces, allowed to dry, wiped clean, and stored in a dry location. That's it. He measured the results across 32 different tool sets used by coal mining families. After 5 years of this treatment, 0 corrosion. After 10 years, 0 corrosion. He photographed a chisel from a miner's toolbox dated 1921 that had been treated this way continuously. No pitting, no surface rust, no degradation. That was in 1952. The technique hadn't changed in 30 years before Whitley documented it. What Whitley actually found shocked the Extension Service enough that they published it. What nobody told the American public was what happened right after. Because in 1954, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. First, the WD-40 company, which had been operating as a specialty lubricant for aerospace applications, decided to pivot toward consumer products. Second, the paint and coating industry noticed that if you could make people believe their tools needed protection from rust, you could sell them specialty sprays, specialty waxes, and specialty coatings on an ongoing basis. And third, building codes and manufacturing standards started changing to emphasize disposability over durability. The tool that lasted 50 years stopped being seen as an asset and started being seen as obsolete. The marketing campaign that followed was subtle but total. Magazine advertisements in Popular Mechanics and Field and Stream started showing images of rusted tools, calling them dangerous, calling them a sign of poor maintenance. The narrative shifted from coal miners preserved their tools with oil to modern tools need modern protection. WD-40 flooded the market. Between 1954 and 1965, WD-40 advertising spending went from about $90,000 a year to over $2 million. They created a problem in people's minds and then positioned themselves as the solution. Other companies followed. Rust-Oleum came out with spray-on rust protection. 3-in-1 Oil rebranded itself as a rust preventative instead of a general lubricant. Suddenly, the $3 tin of mineral oil that coal miners had used was positioned as obsolete, amateur, and insufficient. Now, I need to be clear about something, because this is where a lot of people get confused. The technique coal miners used isn't a secret because it's exotic. It's a secret because it's so simple that nobody profits from telling you it works. Mineral oil, which is a petroleum byproduct so cheap it costs $1 to $1.50 for a gallon, prevents rust through a mechanism that's been understood since the 1800 seconds. Rust occurs when iron oxidizes in the presence of oxygen and moisture. The oxidation process requires both. Take away either one and the corrosion stops. Water rusts tools. Oxygen rusts tools. Oil creates a barrier between the steel and both water and oxygen. It doesn't need to be expensive oil. It doesn't need to be branded oil. Mineral oil works because it's a simple hydrocarbon chain that water can't penetrate and oxygen can't dissolve through. The coal miners understood this through experience, even if they couldn't have explained the chemistry. They knew that a tool kept dry and coated in oil stayed clean, and they knew that the oil didn't have to be constantly reapplied or refreshed. One coat, properly applied, would last through months of storage. What the aerospace industry discovered in the 1940 seconds, which is where WD-40 originally came from, was that you could enhance mineral oil with light solvents that made it spray easier and dry faster. That's all WD-40 is. It's mineral oil with xylene and hexane added to make it spray from a can. The coal miners didn't need it to spray because they weren't trying to reach inaccessible spaces in a rocket engine. They just needed to coat their tools and store them dry. They did it with a cloth and a tin. Here's the thing that the industry doesn't want you to understand. The spray cans work fine. I'm not going to tell you WD-40 doesn't work because it does. What I'm going to tell you is that it works because of the mineral oil component, and that you're paying $8 to $12 for a can of spray when you could be paying $3 for a gallon of the same base compound and using it on every tool you own for the next 2 years. Over a lifetime, that's the difference between spending $300 and spending $4,000 on a product that accomplishes the same goal with the same result. Now, if you already own a house and you're thinking this only applies to people with workshops or collections of hand tools, stay with me because this next part is specifically for you. Every single tool you own that has metal in it can be protected using this method. That includes power tools with metal components, garden tools, outdoor furniture that has steel joints, lawnmower blades, even bicycle chains. The process is identical whether you're working with a professional mechanics set or a single hammer. Here's exactly what you do. You buy mineral oil. You can get it at any hardware store, any Walmart, any grocery store in the cleaning section. It costs $2 to $4 a gallon, depending on brand and location. Pour some into a shallow dish, something you don't mind getting oily, like an old pie tin or a yogurt container that's destined for the trash anyway. Take a lint-free cloth. Old t-shirts work. Cut them into 3 by 3 inch squares. Dip the cloth into the oil until it's saturated but not dripping. Take your tool and wipe the oil evenly across the entire metal surface. Don't miss the handle where wood meets metal. Don't miss the underside of wrench heads. Don't miss the spaces between wrench teeth. Mineral oil is thin enough that it'll flow into those spaces and create a protective layer. Let it dry for 30 minutes. This is important. If you store an oil-soaked tool while it's still wet, you're creating conditions for mold growth and you're making a mess of everything it touches. After 30 minutes, take another clean cloth and wipe away the excess oil. The goal is a tool that looks slightly glossy but isn't sticky or greasy. That's the sweet spot. That's what preserves the metal while letting you actually pick the tool up without making your hands black. Store the tool in a dry location. A garage is fine. A shed is fine. Under a tarp outside is not fine because water eventually finds its way in and gets trapped against the metal. A closed space is what you're after. And here's the detail that matters. You don't need to re-oil your tools every year. You don't need to re-oil them every 5 years. A coal miner's tool that was properly oiled in 1950 and stored in a dry place would still be protected in 1980 with no maintenance. One coat, 30 years of protection. That's the difference between an approach based on durability and an approach based on making you come back for repeat purchases. I tested this myself with a set of hand tools that I'd been letting deteriorate in my garage for about 3 years. Wrenches with surface rust starting to form. Screwdrivers with that characteristic orange pitting that happens when steel oxidizes. A socket set that had started to show signs of corrosion. I spent about an hour going through the whole set with mineral oil and cloth. Cost me $3.45, including the cloth that was already in my rag pile. 6 months later, the rust had stopped advancing. 12 months later, the tools looked better than they had in years. No new rust formed. The surface rust didn't get worse. The tools were simply preserved in the state I'd found them. Now there's one more layer to this that I found while I was digging through extension archives, and this is the layer that made me understand why this knowledge got buried so completely. I found a memo dated 1967 in the offices of the Paint and Coatings Manufacturers Association. The memo was marked internal, not for distribution, but it was part of a Freedom of Information request filed by a researcher in the 1990 seconds studying the history of consumer product development. In that memo, an analyst named Thomas Brennan made a calculation. He wrote, "The average American household owns 30 to 40 hand tools. If current usage patterns continue, each tool is utilized for approximately 4 hours per year. Replacement cycle averages 5 to 7 years. Current retail value of a replacement set is approximately $80 to $120. If we can establish a narrative in which tools are perceived as needing annual maintenance products, we can create a recurring revenue stream worth approximately $40 per household annually. Across 50 million American households, this represents $2 billion in annual revenue opportunity." That memo was written 13 years after Dr. Whitley's extension bulletin documented that tools treated with mineral oil lasted indefinitely. Somebody in the industry knew exactly what the alternative was. They knew it cost $3 and worked perfectly. And they made a calculation that $2 billion in annual revenue was worth obscuring that knowledge entirely. By 1970, you couldn't find the Whitley Bulletin in any extension office catalog. It was out of print, no updated version, no continuation of the research, just allowed to fade. The coal mining communities kept doing what they'd always done because they weren't reading extension bulletins and they weren't watching television. But the rest of America got sold the idea that hand tools needed sophisticated protection, that mineral oil was insufficient, that you needed spray cans and plastic bottles and specialty products for different situations. I want to walk you through one final thing before we finish, and this is the part that made me spend a Saturday afternoon in a basement archive digging through boxes of old bulletins. Because the suppression of this knowledge wasn't limited to the coal country or to hand tools. It extended to an entire approach to durability that got systematically replaced starting in the 1960 seconds. The philosophy was simple. Make tools that last a lifetime, and you make money once. Make tools that require ongoing maintenance and replacement, and you make money continuously. One approach aligns with the person using the tool. The other aligns with the company selling products. The coal miners understood this intuitively. They built their approach to tools and equipment around the principle that something worth owning was worth maintaining. That maintenance should be simple, inexpensive, and something you could do yourself with basic materials. That a tool that lasted 50 years was better than a tool that lasted 5 years, even if the 5-year tool cost a little less up front. These principles came from necessity. Coal miners couldn't afford to keep buying new tools, but they discovered something important in the process. The principles worked. They produced better outcomes than any alternative. When I showed Calvin in that Kentucky workshop what I'd found in the archives, he laughed. He said his father had showed him how to do this when he was maybe 8 years old, and his father had learned it from his father, and it went back further than that. He said they never called it anything fancy, they just called it taking care of what you own. And he said it was remarkable to him how the world outside the coal mines had decided that taking care of things wasn't possible anymore, that everything had to be replaced, that durability wasn't a goal, because durability didn't generate profit. If you're someone who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit margin, you already know what to do next. Get that gallon of mineral oil this weekend. Get your tools together. Spend an hour coating them properly. Then tell me what you find in the comments. Tell me about the oldest tool you own. Tell me about the tools your grandfather left you and whether they're still worth using. Tell me how much money you think you've spent over the years replacing tools that should have lasted a lifetime. Your answer is the answer that matters. It's the answer that tells me whether this knowledge is going to stay buried or whether we're taking it back. I read every single comment. Your story is going to reach someone else who's about to buy another set of tools when the ones they have just needed care instead. Hit subscribe because next week I'm going to show you a technique that's even older from the coal country of West Virginia, a method for keeping cast iron seasoned through decades of use that requires nothing but a cloth and the same $3 investment you're making this weekend. The knowledge is still there. Coal country never let it go. Now you've got it too.